we have been doing this for, what is it, 57 episodes now? 59 episodes, Victor. Thank you for joining us. I am a licensed clinical psychologist and psychiatry professor. So I have a background in mind-body medicine, and I am the CEO of Maximus. Maximus is the sponsor of this radio show. You can check us out at maximustribe.com. We have a safe and effective prescription protocol that allows you to double your testosterone levels taking oral medication, and health coaching to optimize your diet, exercise, sleep, focus, and relationships, which is the theme of this week's show. So I always like to do health coaching with people. If you have any questions about optimizing your health, achieving your New Year's resolutions, and leveling up in terms of your health and functioning, please raise your hand if you're up on Clubhouse. And we also have questions that we take live from YouTube Live, Instagram Live, Twitter Spaces at times, and basically every other social media platform that is out there. So welcome. We host this every week from 6 to 7 p.m. And we have folks ask their questions. We have a bunch from last week that we did not have time to get to. So we usually start off every episode with a weekly unpopular opinion. And this week's, I thought I'd keep it a little bit more psychological in origin. Victor asked this great question about the definition of confidence versus cockiness. And I actually think confidence is paramount as a man in terms of your psychological health and well-being, but also your success in life when it comes to relationships, when it comes to work, etc. So really the question is, what should we teach young boys and young men about confidence and facing their fears when we have this sort of narcissism epidemic as well? A colleague of mine, in fact, at San Diego State wrote a book called Generation Me about the prevalence of narcissism in the social media era, in which everyone obviously focuses on themselves and getting more attention. So I think it's an important psychological distinction between confidence and cockiness, or narcissism, if you will, in that if you actually understand the psychological underpinning or root of narcissism, it actually stems from insecurity. And so even though you have someone who is cocky and, over the top in terms of their presentation, it's a fake kind of confidence, right? It's confidence that comes from a deep-rooted insecurity, and often from, unfortunately, not getting their needs met as children. Narcissistic people often were raised by narcissistic parents that did not validate them unconditionally as human beings and only validated them conditionally for doing the things that they wanted them to do or achieving the things they wanted them to achieve. And so they essentially learned this very extrinsic motivation for doing the things that they do. And that's why narcissists actually end up quite successful professionally and in life, is because they learn, well, in order to be a good boy or a good girl, I have to do certain things in order to feel the love of my parents, but also to eventually feel whole. Obviously, that's very incomplete. And so what you have is sort of a grown child who never sort of truly knew love. And it becomes more of a malignant self-love, in that the narcissist is deeply insecure, and in order to fulfill that underlying need that they have, they almost do the opposite in coming off as very confident in order to validate themselves and get external validation from other people. Now, if you contrast to someone who is deeply secure, was raised by parents who did provide them with unconditional love and support, that instilled in them a intrinsic self-esteem that's based in their self-worth and also based on competence, those folks don't need to compensate by seeking attention so much on social media. We all are human now. We all have some vanity and desire for validation, but the excess is what I'm talking about here. It's more of the strong and silent type, if you will, right? A deeply secure and confident man doesn't need to show off, doesn't need to brag, doesn't need to believe that they're the answer to everything. and that they're the only one that can fix things. You probably have examples of leaders that you can think of that fit the narcissistic mold, and why that's very problematic, because those folks are essentially deeply selfish rather than servant leaders. And so, to a psychologist, even though confidence and cockiness just seem like, to most people, a matter of degree, they're actually literally the opposite phenomenon, where true confidence comes from intrinsic self-esteem, self-worth, and actual competence in fields or skills that you have that you're good at, versus cockiness and narcissism, to me, actually is a sort of a defense or a projection, if you will, of deeply rooted insecurity. And so it's very easy to tell which is which, right? Because the kinds in which, you know, you're bragging about yourself and wanting that validation from other people is more the pathological side of things, versus someone who, you know, let's say they're pitching their business and they're like, look, we got a good thing going. That's genuine confidence, and it doesn't need to be over the top or braggadocious, if you will. So really, the root of it is just to make people feel, you know, a foundational sense of self-worth, which everyone as a human being deserves. And in addition to that, we should, both as parents, you know, siblings and colleagues, reinforce, obviously, real competence. When someone does a good job, you know, validate that behavior. But the important thing is you validate the behavior, not the person, right? You're not good because you won the track meet, or you're not good because you got an A or a gold star. You reinforce the hard work. You're like, I saw how much you practiced in order to be, you know, win that track meet, or I saw how much effort you put into that assignment that you got that A. Great job on the effort, right? So when you put it that way, you're rewarding the behavior, and not saying that, oh, you're smart or not smart, or you're good or you're bad. You're reinforcing the right thing, which is also, by the way, very important for gifted and talented children. Gifted and talented children can get A's without trying very hard. And so if you keep telling them, oh, you're smart, you're smart, you're smart, they just believe that it's because of their God-given talent or genetics. And when they start to, you know, move up the ranks in high school, college, or graduate school, and they're encountering, oh, now I got to really try because everyone is smart, they tend to fall apart because they've been just relying on, you know, last-minute effort or their intelligence to get by, when you should really be encouraging their effort, because that obviously wins in the end, especially in more competitive, you know, echelons and leagues. All right, so that's this week's unpopular opinion. I will take questions from the audience. Thanks everyone who's waving on Instagram. If you want to join, feel free to raise your hand. I can bring you up. Or if you're on Clubhouse, raise your hand. I can bring you up on the audience. Otherwise, we will start with questions from last week. Looks like we got one from YouTube.
We had this question from Discord. Wanted to get your opinion on it. From Mark. Can blood flow restrictions affect testosterone or hormone production? Should men increase their blood flow? Is there a safe way to do that? Is that something men should worry about as they get older?
Yeah, so this is a great question. This is about a technique that's called blood flow restriction training, or KATSU training. This basically involves putting cuffs or armbands on the arms or the legs in order to restrict blood flow and have it sort of pool in that area. And you put those on and lift weights. And it's kind of a biohack, if you will, that supposedly has numerous effects, including increasing testosterone, increasing other biomarkers local to that area, and enhancing hypertrophy, or the ability to gain muscle. Now, I haven't delved deep into the research literature. I have looked at a few studies. From my observation, the results are mixed. There's some promising results in some studies, some not so encouraging results in other studies. And I think there's two really important things to highlight here, is that any sort of increases in testosterone that this technique is going to do are going to be transient and temporary. So it's not a way of elevating your testosterone like we do with Maximus, in which it's going to be high, you know, all the time. And that's really the benefit that you're going to get in terms of putting on muscle and energy and mood and health and vitality. that you get. So from a hormonal perspective, I don't think it's very effective. Now, when it comes to training in terms of putting on muscle, there's a very serious risk that obviously if you cut off blood flow to an area, you're going to cause damage, potentially to the vasculature, the veins, and obviously, worse than that, in that, you don't want to like basically self-amputate yourself. So it's very easy to like underdo it and not get any benefit, or quite frankly overdo it and cut off too much blood. I generally don't recommend people sort of do it themselves. I do know a personal trainer that has done this a lot and works with folks around it. So my recommendation from just a safety standpoint is, if you're interested in KAATSU or blood flow restriction training, is make sure that you get someone who has a lot of experience working with it, has used it themselves, has used it with a bunch of clients, to properly supervise you. I think this gets into the realm of like basically experimental risky treatments. And so I generally don't think, honestly, first of all, it's for most people. Most people don't even go to the gym consistently enough that they need to be hacking their way into doing more complex stuff. This is really for advanced weightlifters who have been lifting for, I would argue, more than a decade, have tried everything else, and this is just taking them to the next level. And you should really do it with supervised by a personal trainer who knows how to do this, in my opinion. Sure, you can do it yourself, but like I said, it's very easy to underdo, overdo. You're not going to get your money's worth, or worse, you're going to develop some medical problems, and you don't want to do that. So I don't do it. I don't personally recommend it, but if you're going to do it, just be safe about it. That's my point of view.
Follow-up question: what's your opinion about redwood supplements, or supplements that increase your red blood cell count or red blood cell flow, with nitric oxide boosters?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a supplement company out there called UMZU that has spent millions of dollars promoting this redwood supplement, talking about blood flow. I give them credit. They make really good ads. Unfortunately, it's not rooted in real science. They keep on putting out stuff that seems scientific, but it's honestly pseudoscientific. I'll give you another example. There was some rat study in which they gave rats a probiotic that increased their testosterone. I actually read the study myself. It seemed pretty compelling. And then I found the probiotic. I tested my testosterone levels before and then after taking the probiotic. And guess what? It had zero effect in me. And that's the common thing that you see all the time, is that you see these promising rat studies where, doubling, tripling their testosterone, taking some herb, some probiotic, and it just doesn't translate to humans. We are not mice. We are not rats. Our HPG axis is more complicated. And, unfortunately, they just cite the study, and then, it's convincing because they're like, look, here, it's a published research paper. Unfortunately, and they stick it in their supplement, making you think that you're going to be some jacked rat. And it's unfortunately not the case. I think it's the same thing with their redwood supplement. Herbal nitric oxide boosters generally don't really do much in terms of creating a meaningful effect, just like herbal testosterone boosters don't really meaningfully increase testosterone. Now, there are two amino acids that are dirt cheap. You don't need to buy it from UMZU, which are L-arginine and L-citrulline, that may have mild effects in terms of increasing nitric oxide. These are commonly found in things like watermelon. And so you can buy these over the counter. They're dirt cheap. And there's some research that it has like a mild, essentially vasodilating effect in terms of whether giving you a pump at the gym or giving you a little bit more blood flow before sexual activity. But honestly, the effect is very mild, not really noteworthy or noticeable for most people. I think the most effective nitric oxide stimulant is actually a prescription drug called tadalafil, or more commonly known as Cialis. Cialis does boost nitric oxide, boosts muscle protein synthesis, gives you a pretty good pump at the gym. Obviously, it's a PDE5 inhibitor, which is good for improving erectile dysfunction or making you harder. And it also has numerous anti-aging effects. It shrinks the prostate, is actually used as a prescription drug for reducing BPH or enlarged prostate. reduces blood pressure as well. One of our advisors, Dr. Eugene Shippen, believes it's basically should be like baby aspirin. Every guy should take it. Yeah, so that's the general preference I have in terms of. I think nitric oxide boosters are honestly overrated, and the only ones that are good are the prescription kind. So that's my take on that. All right, other questions? Feel free to raise your hand if you're on Clubhouse and you have any questions. I'm happy to interact.
We had a question from YouTube last week. Are there any viable ways to optimize beard growth?
Yeah, so the question is about optimizing beard growth. The best current solution on the market is minoxidil. So minoxidil is the generic name. The brand name is Rogaine. You can buy it over the counter at any pharmacy or Costco. I generally prefer the foam version because it lacks propylene glycol, which is a thickener essentially. It's a little bit more expensive, but it's pure. It's probably worth it. There's some preliminary clinical evidence that doing some derma rolling may enhance the effects of minoxidil, which essentially puts very superficial punctures in terms of your skin. It's kind of like exfoliating it on steroids, if you will, and it may allow the minoxidil to sort of penetrate the skin deeper. I don't know if it's necessary, but some people do find that derma rolling is can enhance the effects. I think there are better versions of it out there, like Dr. Pen is a good example. It's a more expensive device, but the problem with the rollers is that it punctures and drags your skin, which creates kind of an unnecessary amount of inflammation and skin wounding. So I think if you're gonna do the derma rolling, in my opinion, get a proper device that just punctures straight up and down, and doesn't drag or tear the skin like the rollers, which are dirt cheap, but not as good. So I would consider minoxidil a relatively safe solution for optimizing beard growth. And then we actually have a prescription product that's coming out that's focused on hair beard growth that will have minoxidil, but also a much more effective prescription product. So just be on the lookout for that. You can join our email list at maximistribe.com. It's a pretty amazing product, and there's a bunch of clinical research that shows that it enhances hair growth, both in men and women, actually. Women obviously deal with their own forms of hair loss, but also want to grow other things, like their eyelashes, for instance, and has been shown to enhance various types of hair growth. Obviously for men who are interested in growing their beards, it's a very effective option as well. Hopefully that will be out in the next couple months. Hey, Sri.
Yes, hi, Dr. Cam. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I had a quick question. I just joined. So last time we spoke about the sleep pattern and the lack of sleep and the remedies for it.
Mm-hmm.
And also not having cell phone next to the bed. Some basic things.
Right.
I was curious about how about the Wi-Fi in the house? Is there any literature that we should be aware of where we having too much exposure to the Wi-Fi or any other electronic equipment will have an impact on sleep?
It's a good question, and honestly, we don't know. There's not a lot of research on both telephone signals, but also Wi-Fi signals that range from 2.4 to 5G now. And it's unclear the effects of sort of like, these high frequency signals. Now, I will say, think there's strong evidence that it's causing any issues. Obviously, there are lots of people who sleep fine despite having lots of telephones and internet in the house. So I would say I'm skeptical that it's a major causative factor of insomnia until proven otherwise. That's generally, I don't know, my point of view as a scientist. But look, in the absence of evidence, one can always be scientific and experiment with things. If you don't have a need to have your internet active at night, you can obviously shut off your router and see if it makes a difference. I would be very methodical about it though, and like track how you sleep with and without it on. Do it over many multiple nights, and ideally have someone else in your house, like your wife or your partner, turn it off without telling you, and just they should track when it's on and off, and you should go look at the data later. The reason for that is obviously there's a placebo effect, right? If you think that you're turning it off and you think it's having an effect, you may sleep better just because you believe it will be so. And people very, very much underestimate the power of the placebo effect. If you even look at antidepressants, for instance, 20% of people probably just feel better just because they are taking a pill that they think works. So if you really, really want to be methodical about it, like I said, do a blinded study in which you have someone else track whether it's been on and off for a week, let's say, switch back and forth, and then you track your sleep for a week, and then at the end you can compare notes and see if it helped. But I would say for most people, it's not a concern. I'm skeptical that it honestly has any effect, just in terms of like levels, just generally floating around your house. But if you're curious, you can always do an experiment, look at the data, and see if it makes a difference for you.
Got it. Thank you. Yeah, I did try to not only have the phone away from the bed, but also put the phone on the airplane mode just as an experiment.
Sure.
To see if it's working. But, well, I can't clearly say that, even though I conducted that experiment. Maybe I'm biased because it's psychological also.
Right.
That, okay, it's airplane mode, so I'm sleeping better, and then one day you forget, but it doesn't matter,
Right.
But I have no clue as to whether it's working or not, but I'll keep a check on that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, here's the interesting thing. I actually think the phone near the bed has a different reason why that's beneficial to keep it out of arm's reach. I don't think it's actually a signal issue. I actually think it's a psychological issue. There does seem to be some evidence that suggests that when our phones are within reach, like within our pockets or within reach, we have this impulse to want to check it, right? That has come from the conditioning of either happening when it's triggered by a notification or an internal signal when we're lonely, bored, tired, stressed, etc. We reach for our phone as an emotional consolation, or obviously to numb those negative feelings. And so I think when the phone is close by, it heightens that sort of addictiveness and that quality to kind of quench our negative emotions. And so when you put it far out of reach, you're reducing essentially the stimulus, right, of the phone being around, or the ability to indulge that internal stimulus. And I kind of clinically have observed that people's sort of anxiety and stress levels and craving goes down when it's out of reach. The other obvious benefit is for a lot of my clients who obviously struggle from problematic phone use or overuse. If you keep it out of reach, then obviously you're much less likely to grab your phone and then go down the YouTube rabbit hole for an hour at night. So when they purposely like put it in a drawer or put it on the opposite side of the room, just so they don't end up wasting time. And so for those two benefits alone, regardless of whether the signals are doing anything to our brains, who knows? I think from a behavioral and psychological standpoint, not having an addictive device within reach, and obviously not engaging in addictive behavior, is worth doing alone.
Got it. Thanks again. I do have an unrelated question, but I just want to pause to see if you have any other speakers who would like to.
We have some YouTube questions, but while you're talking, feel free to ask.
Okay, all right. I'll be quick. We spoke about, remember, I don't know, a few weeks ago I was inquiring about twitching of the muscles and spasms. I do have a question about cracking your joints or popping your joints. I know in most cultures it's bad manners to just, crack your knuckles and,
Sure.
In the public place and stuff like that. Is there a reason where the popping
Yeah, it's unclear why it's louder, but I'll tell you why it happens and what the health effects of it are. The popping or the cracking sound of knuckles or joints is due to the gases that are actually in the joint, and the compression of those gases releases sort of a sound when you pop them or crack your knuckles. So there has been actually some research on that. It does seem that the cracking of the knuckles, if it's done chronically, increases the joint size, like cracking of the knuckles, but it doesn't seem to have any deleterious effects. In fact, there was a physician who did one, in my opinion, one of the most sacrificial studies of medicine next to Salk. He basically cracked the fingers of one hand, only one hand, for a few decades because he was really interested to see would he develop arthritis if he just cracked his knuckles. And then so obviously his other hand was the control hand, right? In terms of, as we were talking about running a methodical experiment, he was literally his own case control trial. So brilliantly done study, and he didn't find after, I don't know how long it was, 20, 30 years, that it created any more hand pain or impairment in function or anything like that. So you can probably crack your knuckles safely, at least on the basis of that one study. It's probably not going to cause chronic pain or arthritis, but it may create a little bit of increase in size. So it's up to you in terms of whether the aesthetic or the social downsides are worth it, worth the satisfaction.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
And then to follow up on some of your other questions, we did have some commenters. I want to read their responses from YouTube. Someone commented and said there are devices you can buy to measure EMR radiation. The radiation has only a range of a few feet. So I guess if you're really interested, you can go measure that. They commented, I certainly wouldn't sleep with my head right next to a Wi-Fi router, but it's generally not a problem. Cell phones really don't give enough radiation for it to reach you from a nightstand. So thanks for chiming in on that. And then we got two other questions from YouTube. You want to read the top one there, Victor?
First question via YouTube. Thoughts on SARMs, SARMS. I've had a couple friends take them and want to show them the dangers of it.
So the question is about SARMs. SARMs are selective androgen receptor modulators, not to be confused with SERMs, selective estrogen receptor modulators. So the androgen receptor is the receptor that testosterone binds to. The estrogen receptor is what estradiol binds to. So they work in completely different ways. SARMs are basically underground anabolic steroids. You should think about them that way because that's what they are and that's how they function. The first thing in terms of a danger is that they aren't well studied. Most of these SARMs essentially exist on the black market because pharmaceutical companies have been conducting clinical trials to test these for muscle wasting and other conditions in which building muscle are helpful. The idea is that they've been cleverly designed to have a greater anabolic to androgenic ratio so that they have the muscle building effects without the negative effects on, let's say, your prostate. So that's great in theory. The problem is a lot of these SARMs have actually failed clinical trials due to safety issues. So for instance, a SARM, which is commonly known as S4, seems to cause some visual side effects in terms of literally making you see, other colors that you shouldn't be seeing. So, taking an experimental drug that has not been approved at all, has no safety history, and also is produced in the black market. These because they're not coming from a U.S. based pharmacy, they're produced essentially bootleg in China. It's like drinking bathtub gin essentially, and you don't even know that what you're taking is a SARM or the same SARM that you thought, or it's not polluted because the chemical reaction that they did was not very clean, and so it may have toxins, heavy metals, or other pollutants. So I generally discourage people from taking any drug that's not coming from a pharmacy because you just don't know what you're getting and having it be pharmaceutically pure. Now, it does seem that a lot of the underground stuff is some sort of SARM. Like I said, I don't know how pure it is, but the downside is there's been this myth that they're not suppressive. And there's been a lot of folks on Reddit who's posted blood work looking at their lab values before and after taking SARMs, and it's absolutely suppressive, meaning it shuts down your testosterone production literally within weeks. And so while it may have some muscle building effects, it's really no different than other steroids in the sense that it shuts you down. And so if you're taking it thinking that it's a safer version of steroids, it's really not. And in fact, in some ways, it's actually worse because unlike, let's say, testosterone, which has minimal effects on your lipids, SARMs do actually have some pretty deleterious effects on your lipids in terms of increasing your LDL, crushing your HDL, crushing your SHBG. These are known side effects, not just from the research literature, but from anecdotal evidence of people doing lab works as well. So they're not safe to take long term. They shut down your testosterone production. They shut down a whole bunch of other hormones that are really important, and they mess with your lipids. So you're probably increasing your risk for heart disease if you do take them long term. So I generally discourage people from doing that. Like, why treat yourself, your body, like a guinea pig, just because they're available on the black market. Samrat, did you have a question?
Yeah, hello.
Hi there.
Good morning.
Morning. I'm guessing you're on the other side of the world because it's 6:30 p.m. on this side.
Okay. So the topic is testosterone.
Sorry, can you speak up?
So today the topic is testosterone, side effect and effect.
Sorry, what's the question?
My name is Bishwajit Das. I am from West Bengal. I'm in India.
Oh, wonderful. Did you have a specific question?
Yeah, actually, so my question is that testosterone, it is a natural hormone in our body,
Yep.
and when its emission is not enough, then we have a lots of problems, right? And for this reason, most of the people which have no any muscular body, like they are thin person, they use testosterone for build up their body. Okay, to do this, they have lots of side effects. So now it's good or bad. I mean, testosterone, when we have some problem, like we are thin person, we are not unable to do some work, like this types of problem, we can take testosterone easily. Doctor advise us to take testosterone, but when we take it like more than we need, then it's very harmful for us. Am I right?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So you're there's kind of two parts to what you're saying, which I'll try to summarize. Is when people are low in testosterone, which unfortunately is increasingly common these days. So, for instance, there was a research study that looked at men over the age of 40, and about 39% of them had total testosterone levels under 300 nanograms per deciliter, which is generally, below the normal range. And unfortunately, that's exceedingly common, both generationally, meaning that you have half the testosterone that your father did, often due to endocrine disrupting chemicals in our environment, and also due to age-related metabolic disease. People these days, whether they're in India or the US, are increasingly overweight and have diabetes, and these sort of metabolic conditions decrease our testosterone as well. And as you pointed out, it has all kinds of negative side effects. So it increases your body fat, impairs your ability to put on muscle, saps your energy levels, but also your mood, drive, and confidence to do well at work, in your social life, in your relationship. Testosterone is the hormone of making effort feel good, as I like to say. So that's why it's beneficial to make sure that your natural testosterone levels are high, or at least optimal. To your point, it sounds like maybe folks in India, if I heard you correctly, or doctors in India recommend that you replace your testosterone. The downside of that, though, is it shuts down your own production. When you take external testosterone, or what's called exogenous testosterone, it causes testicular shutdown. So your testicles stop producing their own testosterone, they shrink, and you become infertile. So in fact, most men don't realize that testosterone replacement therapy, or TRT, is essentially a male contraceptive, and it really shouldn't be taken by anyone under the age of 50, or certainly anyone who wants to maintain their fertility and ability to have children. So I don't think it's a good solution for most people. I think it's really should be treated as a treatment of last resort for folks whose testicles do not work, which is a very small percentage of men. For most people, they should actually do what's called testosterone restoration instead of replacement. And that's what we do at Maximus. We use a SARM, a selective estrogen receptor modulator, which I alluded to earlier. It's called enclomiphene. It's essentially an isomer of Clomid that has been purified and is the active ingredient that increases testosterone. How it works is pretty simple. It blocks the estrogen receptor. And when your body sees that happening, it realizes, oh, I need to get more estrogen. Let me produce more testosterone, where estrogen is derived from. And so as opposed to shutting down your testicles, it actually stimulates your testicles to produce more of its own natural testosterone. And so I think it's a much safer approach. It has been used successfully in healthy young men as young as 18 without major side effects, and should really be used as the first line treatment, in addition to obviously lifestyle counseling, improving diet, exercise, sleep, focus, making sure that people are losing their excess body fat. And that's also part of the Maximus King Protocol that we offer. So if you're interested in that and you're located in the United States, unfortunately we don't serve India right now, you can check us out at maximistribe.com. We are in 13 US states, so we cover about 40% of the US population, and we'll be in, I think, 5 or 6 more pretty soon. So if we don't serve you right now, make sure you get on our email list, and we'll let you know when we launch in your local state.
We had another question via YouTube. This one has to do more with psychology. Why, in your opinion, do psychiatrists seem to shy away from treating depression by optimizing hormones? Rather, they typically first reach for SSRIs, SNRIs, NRIs, atypicals, etc.
Yeah, this is a great question, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart since I'm a clinical professor of psychiatry and I train psychiatrists. My focus is on training them in psychotherapy more than psychopharmacology, but I'm very familiar with their typical treatment approach. And I think the reason for that is simply because the pharmaceutical industry, starting in the 1990s with fluoxetine or Prozac, which is one of these SSRIs that you mentioned, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, really promoted that as the first line approach for treating depression. The reason for this was because previously the pharmaceutical treatment for depression were MAOIs, which often had kind of side effects and had severe limitations. Like you couldn't, for instance, eat cheese because it had this kind of crazy interaction effect with MAOIs and other foods. So you had to kind of put people on a restricted diet. SSRIs don't have sort of these food restriction effects, and were supposedly better in terms of their side effect profile and safety profile. And so really kind of revolutionized psychiatry and became the first line treatment. And still to this day, there was a lot of research that was conducted. SSRIs are generally the first line treatment for treating, bread and butter depression and anxiety. There are other classes that you mentioned as well, SNRIs, serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors like the Wellbutrins of the world, NRIs, norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors, which are like the Ritalins of the world, and then there's atypical medications as well, and atypical antidepressants as well. And the reason for this is just there's more research that has been conducted on using these drugs for these purposes because the pharmaceutical companies have promoted the use of them and paid for the clinical trials, and so there's just a lot more evidence. And as psychiatry essentially moved into being more of an evidence-based field like the rest of medicine, if you think about it, actually, like going back to the 1960s, the first line treatment back then was psychoanalytic psychotherapy, right? Psychiatrists actually didn't prescribe very much medications back then. Therapy was always the first line. And it's kind of a sad tragedy that that's no longer the case. They make a lot more money prescribing medications than doing psychotherapy, and they've kind of left psychotherapy to psychologists and master's level practitioners in addition to the doctoral level psychologists as well. Because, well, you can see 4 patients in an hour prescribing medications versus 1 patient per hour doing therapy. Yeah, that's unfortunately the reason why. And I think just because psychiatry is trying to be an evidence-based field, they want to provide treatments that have the most evidence behind them. Unfortunately, it's turned out that a lot of these medications, even though they can be effective, for instance, for severe depression, OCD, etc., don't always do better than placebo when it comes to mild to moderate depression. So I actually do think there really should be more research done on non-monoamine hypothesis-based approaches to psychiatry, meaning, there was this oversimplification that serotonin is the happiness molecule. And so if you're unhappy, all you have to do is increase your serotonin. It's a great little story. It's not that simple, though. The brain and our happiness is a biopsychosocial phenomenon. It's not just based on one neurotransmitter, but it's probably based on all kinds of neurochemicals, including hormones. It's obviously based on our social environment, our literal environment, our genetic environment, and the epigenetic environment in terms of which genes get turned on. And so the reality is it would be great if there was a magic serotonin pill that worked for everyone. Unfortunately, it works for some people, doesn't work for all people. They do have their own side effects in terms of anorgasmia, sexual dysfunction, and for some people actually exacerbates suicidality, which is why some of them actually have black box warnings. So I really am hoping that there's more research done in this new field that you mentioned called neuroendocrinology, which is essentially looking at how hormones influence the brain and function. And I actually think it's very promising. I'll give you an anecdote from our own company. We don't treat depression, but we do look at depressive symptomatology in terms of depression and anxiety. We use the PHQ, which is an evidence-based clinical questionnaire, and we do find significant improvements in reductions in self-reported depression and anxiety symptoms when you increase their testosterone, right? Nobody's talking about this. Now, is this better than SSRIs? Those head-to-head studies have not been done. And I'm not recommending it as a treatment for depression. I don't think there's sufficient evidence there. But it does seem to make sense that there does seem to be this link between low testosterone and low mood or depression. Now, is it a chicken or the egg issue? It's probably both. Low testosterone does seem to reduce mood, and also clinically severe depression does seem to be associated with low testosterone. So maybe this sort of negative snowball effect that happens. But I think, given the SSRIs, SNRIs, NRIs, atypical antidepressants, as you mentioned, do have significant side effects and also don't really work for everyone, I think we really should start exploring more of this hormonal optimization approach in terms of feeling better, because hormones obviously do have effects on not only the body but the mind as well. So that's something that I'm hoping our company will contribute to the literature. And more people should explore it as well in terms of publishing.
We had a question last week that we didn't get to. Been thinking about doing ketamine therapy. What's your opinion on ketamine therapy? Do you think it really works? Any scientific facts to back it up?
Yeah, it's a great question. Speaking of alternative treatments for depression, ketamine is an increasingly popular option. The FDA actually approved S-ketamine, a variant of ketamine. Ketamine has been around for decades. It's an anesthetic drug, so it's used in the context of surgery to knock you out so that you don't experience pain, but those are obviously high dosage. They use sort of sub-anesthetic dosages as a treatment for depression. What's remarkable about ketamine is 2 things. One, it doesn't work on the serotonin system. It actually works on a different neurotransmitter system called the NMDA system. So it has a different mechanism of action working on NMDA and glutamate. So it's a novel approach, essentially. Works on a different part of the brain, if you will. And the second thing, it seems to have very rapid acting effects. The SSRIs that we talked about typically take oh, 4 to 8 weeks, sometimes 12 weeks to have an effect. Oftentimes people go through several SSRIs in terms of trial and error, in terms of finding one that works for them. And so that can be a very painful process, right? Like you're sitting there depressed, you know, you're not productive, your libido's messed up, you're not able to sleep. You have all sort of the typical symptoms of depression. And, you know, your doctor's like, well, I got something for you, but let's see how you do over 2 to 3 months. That can be a little daunting, I think, for folks. Versus, you know, the studies that were using IV ketamine often had effects like basically immediately. Not for everyone, and I don't think it's a panacea or a magic pill, but it does seem to have much more of a rapid acting effect. And so I think that's why the FDA approved esketamine. And then there's a bunch of companies out there that are prescribing the original ketamine, the anesthetic, off-label in a sublingual form. So instead of injecting it, you take a little tablet, it dissolves under your tongue. But it still has a pretty powerful effect if you use a high enough dose, like 600 to 700 milligrams. Just in terms of disclosure, I am an advisor to one of these companies called MindBloom. You can check them out at MindBloom. I helped develop their clinical protocol, and I think they take a pretty safe and effective approach to treating depression. I always tell people it's not a panacea. It's not a magic cure for depression. Look, there's no pill that will give you a meaningful and fulfilling life. That comes from the hard work of doing therapy and going out there in the real world and, you know, finding a meaningful relationship, doing great work, you know, raising a family. That's the stuff that obviously creates contentment. But in terms of overcoming the depression that may be a barrier to obviously going and doing those things, this is just another tool in the tool belt. And I'm obviously supportive of other tools that are evidence-based and out there. So if you have tried, you know, maybe more standard treatment approaches, you know, you've done your therapy, you've tried SSRIs, it hasn't worked for you, ketamine may be a good viable alternative. So talk to your own doctor about that. I'm not necessarily recommending it, but I do know that MindBloom, which I'm obviously affiliated with, does take a thoughtful and safe approach to medically supervised at-home ketamine therapy. So I do think it's a promising new treatment approach. And so, you know, I think people should look into it as one of many options and alternatives. All right. Other folks, you want to raise your hand on Clubhouse and ask any questions? Feel free to come up.
We had a question from YouTube last week. What is allulose? Do you recommend it? Any thoughts because it's showing up banned in Canada?
Yeah, it's a great question. Allulose is essentially a sugar substitute, but what's unique about it is a natural sugar substitute in that it's naturally occurring in certain plants like wheat and berries in very minute quantities. What's interesting biochemically about allulose is that it's not metabolized for the most part. I believe if you consume it, 70% of it, you just urinate it out. And so it's not broken down and it doesn't have a glycemic effect, meaning it doesn't increase your blood sugar levels. So it's a very diabetic friendly sugar substitute. But the thing that's remarkable about it, as opposed to, let's say, stevia or monk fruit, which are also natural sugar substitutes, is that those two are very concentrated and they don't taste like sugar. Stevia typically has a bitter aftertaste. Monk fruit just has a weird fruity sweet taste. So they just are not the same as sugar. And you know, the Coca-Cola has tried to spend millions of dollars finding the, you know, next best sugar substitute. There obviously are artificial ones like sucralose, etc., that do taste pretty sweet, but we don't really know the safety of those long term. So allulose is kind of an interesting in the middle because it looks like sugar, it tastes like sugar. The difference is that it's about 70% as sweet as sugar. And so if you're using it in a baking recipe, if it calls for like a cup of sugar and making chocolate chip cookies, you have to either use 30% more, or there are very clever products on the market here in the US in which they combine allulose with just a little bit of monk fruit to make up for that 30% less sweetness. And so you can actually use it 1-to-1 in the recipes if you use these sort of allulose monk fruit blends that have been blended to be 100% sweet as normal sugar. But it maintains that crystal-like, structure that, granulated or refined sugar has. And so the nice thing about that is you can use it to, for instance, make ice cream because it maintains the texture of the ice cream. That's why you don't see monk fruit and stevia really commonly used in ice cream unless it's used with a sugar alcohol like erythritol. It's my favorite sugar substitute. I think the best thing is obviously not to consume any sugar or sugar substitutes. But if you're going to use one anyway, allulose is my preferred choice. The only trick with allulose is that you can't consume more than about 10 grams at a time. It does function like sugar alcohols in that it will cause some gastrointestinal distress if you consume too much. So it will cause, like, basically, because as I mentioned, it doesn't get metabolized, some gas, can cause some constipation, potentially cause diarrhea if you take too much. So it's not that it's bad to take, it's just limit your consumption to no more than 10 grams at a time, no more than, I would say, about 30 grams per day. As long as you keep it in low dosages, it seems to be a very good option, or a good sugar substitute option. I'm increasingly seeing it more in like candies and chocolate, which I think is great because I'm not a fan of the sugar alcohols. The erythritol and other sugar alcohols cause a lot more GI issues. If you ever want to have a good laugh, go look up sugar-free gummy bears on Amazon that are under the Haribo brand, and people talk about the terrible GI issues that people have when they consume those or bring a bag of those to work and unleash all hell on their coworkers, which is unethical but hilarious if you read the stories. I don't know why it's banned in Canada. I do know that, like, whenever new supplements or new ingredients come onto the market, each country has their own mechanism for approving it. In the US, it's been considered, it's given GRAS status, which is generally recognized as safe. Canada probably has its own, approval process. So it may not be, I'm not sure if it's banned or it just hasn't been approved yet. But I do know it exists in the UK and the US. Has been used safely for a long time. And like I said, because it's naturally occurring, at least in small quantities, it may be safer than some of the more synthetic or artificial stuff that's out there. Yeah, maybe it would hurt their maple syrup industry, so that could be why as well.
We had a comment via YouTube. I realize there isn't one answer, and you probably answered this before, but what do you believe is the number one thing men can do to raise their testosterone naturally?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, it depends on what you mean by natural. I would actually argue the Maximus King Protocol is natural in the sense that even though it's a pharmaceutical drug, it's stimulating your own natural testosterone production. So I actually would argue that someone on our protocol is quote unquote natty, to use sort of internet bodybuilder slang, because it's not synthetic testosterone that you're injecting, or you're not taking a steroid or a SARM that's mimicking testosterone. It's your real natural testosterone that comes from your testes. And so that's by far the most effective way of raising your natural testosterone. And that's why we started the whole company. So if you're interested in that, check it out at MaximusTribe.com. The whole natural thing, by the way, I find to be arbitrary. It's like, take allulose, for instance. It occurs naturally in wheat and berries, but the allulose that you buy has been produced in a factory. It's not been extracted. So is it natural or is it artificial? Like, you can make both arguments, right? Because it is literally artificially produced, but it's a naturally occurring substance, and so it's bioidentical to that. Is it natural? Is it not? It depends on your definition. And so it's the same thing with enclomiphene. Enclomiphene is not a natural molecule. It's synthesized by a pharmaceutical company. But when you take it, it stimulates your brain to produce more LH and FSH, which stimulates your testes to produce more natural testosterone. Is that artificial? Is it natural? Depends on your definition. But I think when you have stuff that is kind of in between, I would argue it still can be considered natural. You can certainly make that argument. And so I think that's the best thing that you can do naturally. Next to the King Protocol, although one part of the King Protocol is behavior change, I think the best thing that people can do is reduce their body fat. So that's why we do health coaching as part of our protocol. If you're interested in taking a look at what the coaching looks like, you can join our Discord at Discord, maximustribe.com/Discord. There's a coaching channel, it's #coaching, in which we coach people about how to lose excess body fat. If you don't have visible abs, it's kind of a good, easy visual metric. You probably have body fat that's over 15% as a guy. And at that point, you are probably have excess body fat that increases aromatase, and aromatase converts your precious testosterone into estrogen, and that lowers your testosterone. So if you have extra or excess body fat, that's the other thing that's really important to do. Particularly, I would argue, if you're obese, not just like over 15%, but we're talking over, 20 to 25% body fat. You clearly have a beer belly or gut. That's definitely hurting your testosterone levels, and even more important to lose that excess body fat or belly fat. So that's the second thing that I would recommend. And then the third and last thing is just try to minimize excess xenoestrogens or endocrine disrupting chemicals. Best thing you can do there is don't touch receipts, drink a filtered water, and don't cook in cookware that's non-stick. Those are probably the top three sources of endocrine disrupting chemicals. So, cook your stuff in glass, carry your water in glass or steel bottles. Don't drink too much out of soda cans, which are lined actually with chemicals or plastics. So reducing sort of your chemical load that's coming from the environment will make sure that you're not getting too much of these synthetic environmental estrogens that are sapping your testosterone. So that's like my top 3 tips for raising testosterone so-called naturally. All right, I think we are coming up on time. Thank you everyone for a really great radio show 59. You can join us every single week, every Thursday at 6 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube Live, Clubhouse, Instagram Live, and all the other channels that we support. So thank you. Have a healthy, happy rest of your Thursday, and you can check us out and continue the conversation offline at maximustribe.com/Discord. And if you're interested in obviously increasing your testosterone safely and effectively, you can check out our protocol at maximustribe.com. Thanks everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.